Since Ukraine's EuroMaidan revolution some 18 months ago, there's been a wave of new nationalism and patriotism in the country. But what exactly does this mean, and what sort of connotations does it have? Well, I'm pleased to say here on Ukraine Today, we have Anne Applebaum. She is an author, historian, and journalist, and an expert on this topic. And she joins us here at America House here in Kiev. Anne, thank you very much for joining us. So firstly, I wanted to ask you about the main features of Ukrainian nationalism. Now, first of all, a lot of people think of Stepan Bandera, or more recently the Azov Battalion. But people forget about the first 2 decades of the 20th century, where you had this liberal movement after the First World War. So why do you think there is still this misunderstanding in Ukraine about what nationalism really is?
Well, historically, nationalism was often associated with liberal democracy. Nationalism in the 19th century was inclusive. It was intended to include people in a national narrative, and it was actually as opposed to aristocracy, or as opposed to more traditional ways of ruling societies. And the Ukrainian nationalist movement, as it was called in the late 19th century and the first half of the 20th century, first 20 years of the 20th century, really belonged to that tradition. And there were many different facets of it, and it was a very chaotic moment in Tsarist and European history. So it's, one has to be careful about making generalizations. But certainly the government which briefly ruled Ukraine between 1917 and 1919, in at least one of its versions, it aspired to be a democratic, liberal nationalist government. The history of Ukraine after that, through the 20s and 30s, really was the history of how that movement was destroyed, physically destroyed. Its leaders were repressed. Many of them were jailed or shot. The peasants who had been part of that movement were also targeted during the famine. And so the repression of nationalism was really part of the Sovietization process in Ukraine. The revivals of some kind of Ukrainian national movement or independent movement after that were only happened in periods of violence or extreme. And this was Bandera era, I guess. The war was a moment of extreme ideologies of all kind and extreme reactions.
It's very kind of authoritarian, I guess. Would you describe it like that, or?
I don't think that it's even fair to give it that kind of term, because it was a military movement. So he was a military leader attempting to make a good. He never ruled a country. So giving him political attributes doesn't really make sense. But since before the war, there really hasn't been until 1990, there was no outlet for any kind of normal or what the Soviet Union called bourgeois nationalism, a kind of liberal nationalism or democratic nationalism to form. And so when it began again in 1990-91, it was really starting from scratch. I mean, there was nobody who remembered alive who remembered the earlier experience.
Yes.
So there was no evidence of it. It was very easy to slander. It was very easy to undermine, and even the aspiration towards it was very easy to attack.
And these historical perspectives, are they still important in Ukraine nowadays? So, for example, after the First World War, Ukraine was split into 4. So do you think that that's still relevant today? Do you think there's still different ideas of nationalism across the country, from the west to the east?
History still matters here as it does everywhere else, and people have particular family memories and so on. I'm not sure, though, that Ukraine's history is actually any more complex than that of any other European country. I mean, if you think about Germany wasn't united until the late 19th century. It still had very different components to it. Italy, same, has those are very different parts of Italy. Southern Italy and northern Italy have very different conceptions of the state and of what the Italian nation means. Poland, until the Second World War, was a very divided country, very unevenly governed. It was put together after having been divided into three after 1918. So, there are a lot of other European countries that are, which knit together different cultures. Belgium, is two cultures. Canada is two cultures.
Yeah.
So it's quite common, in fact, in European history.
And now we're living in a more globalized world. So do you think that's important? For example, if you live in Donetsk, in Lugansk, in the east of Ukraine, you're not far from the Russian border, and there's not really like this fence that separates the two countries. I mean, is that important?
Well, there never was.
Well, exactly.
As there was no fence between Germany and France, and the border moved back and forth for centuries.
So
there was no fence between Poland and Germany. It's the same thing. That's a common experience in Europe, and actually, the sort of joint decision that Europeans made after the Second World War to stop fighting over borders, and the creation of the EU and to some extent of NATO as well, the intention of that was to make sure that there weren't these national conflicts over borders anymore. And of course, Ukraine wasn't part of that.
Yeah, and that brings me on to my next topic, because you have this nationalism which can cross borders, but you have patriotism, which is different, and both terms often get confused. So, from your research, extensive research, what are the differences between patriotism and nationalism?
Well, it depends on who's using the word and what the context is. I mean, I as I said in my lecture here in Kiev, I would like to recapture the word nationalism and give it the old meaning and the meaning, which was the positive meaning, which was closer to the word that we now call patriotism. I mean, in order to have a democracy, you need some kind of patriotism, or whether you want to call it nationalism, or whether you want to call it, national identity or something else.
Yeah.
You need people to feel some responsibility for and link to the state in which they live. And if they don't have that, then why would they participate in elections or participate in public life? Or
because it's the love of one's country, I guess.
The love of one's country, one's space, the desire to make the place one lives better, the desire for all the people who live in it, and not just for you and your family or your clan or your tribe, but to have it. This is what sometimes people make a distinction between ethnic nationalism and civic nationalism. Civic nationalism meaning something more like state-based patriotism, and ethnic nationalism meaning something narrower. But there are many shades in between. I mean, I think the point is, to feel connected to and feel responsibility for the place in which you live is incredibly important. And actually, I don't think you can have any kind of democracy or any kind of liberal society without it.
And where should this nationalism or this idea come from? Is it more from civil society, like we've seen during the EuroMaidan, or should it be more from the government now? Should they be promoting it?
It can come from both. I mean, I think historically it has come from both in different countries. I mean, France, it was often top down.
Yeah.
In the U.S., it was often bottom up. But the government can certainly help encourage, a kind of good form of civic patriotism.
Have you seen this from your travels around Ukraine and the people that you've spoken to? Have you seen this sort of national identity grow, I guess, since the EuroMaidan?
I think it's still quite weak.
Yeah?
I think I should say from the government side.
Yes,
I think among people, I think it's grown quite a lot. I mean, I think, the Russian invasion has made people very aware that they want to live in a country with different values from those of Russia. Whether or not they feel, their cousins are Russian and their grandmother's probably Russian and so on, but they're associating their patriotism with a kind of state. We're not the kind of state that does this kind of invasion, and we would like to resist that. And so that has given people a sense of identity. Some people, anyway.
Yeah. Now, I know you're short on time. I just have a very few quick questions. So we have mainland Ukraine that's government-controlled, but also we have this idea of Novorossiya, which came about after the invasion of Crimea in March last year. What sort of identity does Novorossiya have for the people in Donbass? Is there an identity?
I think Novorossiya has failed as an idea. Novorossiya was a Putinist idea. That it was the idea of creating a sort of new. But
was it imperialist kind of based, or?
No. It's an old. It goes back to the creation of Transnistria, or the idea of an independent Abkhazia. Putin had this idea that he could create a new state out of Russian-speaking Eastern Ukraine. Novorossiya is a failure. I mean, it didn't succeed. They didn't get anybody to buy into it. They didn't find any enthusiasm for it. I mean, I think Putin believed his own propaganda, and that he believed that Eastern Ukrainians who spoke Russian were Russians. And it turned out that they're not. or they didn't want to identify with the kind of Russia he was presenting them. So Novorossiya is now a project that has failed. I mean, it's not happening. You know, the idea of it was, if you've seen the maps, that it was going to go all the way to the sea, and it was going to be a lot larger than what it is. And what they have now is a piece of Donetsk and Luhansk, which is they've managed to defend militarily, but there's no enthusiasm for it in the.
So any change of opinion there is just through the Kremlin's information war.
No, basically, the Kremlin decided, you know, a few weeks ago to stop fighing there, and so the fighting there has stopped, and that's what's happened. So for the moment, they seem to have given up on the Novorossiya project.
And now, from your experiences in Ukraine, what sort of changes have you seen since EuroMaidan? For example, have you been to Eastern Ukraine? Have you heard the views from Kyiv?
I haven't been to Eastern Ukraine. I mean, I've been back and forth to Kiev a number of times, and I've been to Lviv and some other places. But you know, Ukraine, I mean, to me, the most striking changes are between now and 10 years ago. I mean, Ukraine really feels like a much different, there's clearly been a generational change in terms of people's attitude towards the world and the way they talk and deal with each other. And
do you think this will continue in the future as well?
I think it continues inevitably, yes. Yeah. I mean, no matter what the next government is going to be. But I mean, there is clearly a kind of general, there's been a generational change. People have different kinds of relations with each other. People speak differently and act differently than they used to. So it's changing very rapidly. I mean, that was true of Poland in the 1990s and 2000s as well when I lived there. So.
Yeah. Okay, Anne, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks.
That was Anne Applebaum. She is an author, journalist and historian, and she's been speaking to us about nationalism and patriotism in Ukraine. Now, back to the news.